Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, May 28th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Ukraine says that France will send military trainers. So on Monday, Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief Oleksandr Syrskyi said France was planning to send instructors to Ukraine to train Ukrainian troops. And of course, this would be a step that would mark a significant escalation of NATO involvement in the proxy war. So Syrskyi spoke with France's defense minister, and then after the conversation, he wrote on Telegram, quote, "I am pleased to welcome France's initiative to send instructors to Ukraine to train Ukrainian servicemen. I have already signed the documents that will enable the first French instructors to visit our training center shortly and familiarize themselves with their infrastructure and personnel," end quote. So when asked about these comments, the French Defense Ministry acknowledged that the issue of sending troops to Ukraine for training was being discussed, but it gave no indication on whether a deployment was imminent. So this response from France, again, this is France's defense ministry. They're asked by Reuters about what Syrskyi said. It's kind of vague, but they're not denying what he said. And what he said is that France is planning to send troops to Ukraine to train Ukrainian soldiers. So the French Defense Ministry said in response, again, kind of vague, quote, "As already mentioned several times, training on Ukrainian soil is one of the projects discussed since the Conference on Support for Ukraine convened by the President of the Republic on February 26th. Like all the projects discussed at that time, this track continues to be the subject of work with the Ukrainians, in particular to understand their exact needs," end quote. So for months now, French President Emmanuel Macron has entertained the possibility of deploying troops to Ukraine, and other NATO members have expressed support for the idea of a training mission, including Estonia and Lithuania, despite the risk of provoking a direct NATO-Russia war. The New York Times recently reported that Ukraine had requested NATO send troops to its territory to train their soldiers, and that report said that NATO countries were inching closer to obliging that request. And now it looks like France is on its way to doing that. And all of this talk, I think Russia has made it clear that there is a very good chance if they deploy, there's no indication on what the number of troops might be, but if they deploy troops, in open public deployment, I think there is a good chance that Russia targets them. And then what would happen? I mean, the fact that we're even having this conversation is completely insane. The risk, what's the reward for this risk? Anyway, one important point here is that with all this talk about the possibility of NATO sending troops to Ukraine, it has highlighted the fact that there are already NATO troops inside Ukraine. A small number, we don't know the extent of it. The Discord leaks as of March 2023 said that there was 97 NATO Special Operations soldiers in Ukraine. We've seen reports lately about British soldiers on the ground helping Ukraine use the Storm Shadow missiles. There's rumors. I know French troops were part of the force that was there, as revealed by the Discord leaks. There's been rumors that France has already sent some troops, but nothing confirmed and nothing official. Again, this would be just another level. It's sending, even if it's a small team of military trainers, openly sending them to Ukraine, to train Ukrainian soldiers. Huge provocation. And again, what is the reward here that they could, they've been training the Ukrainian soldiers elsewhere in Europe. This war, they're losing this war. They have no chance of winning this war. It's just completely reckless to do something like this. And it looks like France is on its way. And I think we're going to see some of the smaller, if this happens, we're going to see some of the smaller NATO countries like Estonia, Lithuania go along with it. And this is just going to be another thing that was ruled out in the beginning, no boots on the ground. And then here we have, even though, again, it's important to point out that we know there is a small unofficial presence already, but this would be a totally different animal. And this is something it appears to be in the works. It appears to be happening. All right. So the next one here, Sweden says that Ukraine can use Swedish weapons on Russian territory. So Sweden has given Ukraine the green light to use Swedish weapons in attacks on Russian territory. And this is a move that is seen as an effort to influence other NATO countries that supply long-range missiles to do the same. This was Sweden's defense minister, Paul Johnson. I'm probably pronouncing that Swedish name wrong. But anyway, he was asked about the possibility of Ukraine using Swedish weapons on Russian territory, and he replied, quote, Ukraine has the right to defend itself through military actions aimed at the enemy's territory as long as the military actions comply with the laws of war, end quote. So since Russia invaded back in February 2022, Sweden has provided Ukraine with about $3.5 billion in military aid, and that includes anti-ship missiles, anti-tank launchers, and these howitzers that are called the Archer self-propelled howitzers. So none of this has really any kind of long range. According to a Ukrainian news site, Defense Express, these Archer howitzers could hit targets up to about 37 miles if they're armed with the Excalibur artillery shells that are GPS guided. But if you remember my story from yesterday, apparently Russia has basically made those Excalibur shells ineffective. So I think without that, you'll see, kind of a typical howitzer range of like 15 miles maybe. So nothing really that significant that Sweden has that Ukraine could use to hit Russian territory. But, this is just what I think, we saw this with the tanks and the planes. You see the countries, the smaller countries that don't have many tanks, they're the first ones to say, hey, we'll send our tanks. And then that eventually got Germany to agree and then the U.S. to agree. So this is kind of a pattern that we have seen. And these comments came amid, there's growing calls within NATO. You have Stoltenberg just said it the other day that they got to let Ukraine use these missiles to hit Russian territory. And Russia actually responded to that. The Kremlin condemned Stoltenberg's comments. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, quote, NATO is increasing the degree of escalation. NATO is flirting with military rhetoric and falling into military ecstasy, end quote. So another just very concerning escalation that's happening here. They're really pushing for this. And again, every sign points to Ukraine not standing a chance to win this war on the battlefield yet. They're still just pushing for all these huge escalations in this proxy war. Okay, so the next one here, NATO allies are skeptical about a $100 billion plan for Ukraine. So Politico reported on Sunday that NATO allies are seeking clarification about a proposal by NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg to provide Ukraine with over $100 billion in military aid over 5 years. The proposal is part of a plan to ensure long-term NATO support for Ukraine to tie the hands of a future American president who may want to wind the war down. And this has become known as Trump-proofing the proxy war, although it is important to point out that Trump backed House Speaker Mike Johnson as he advanced the $61 billion in spending on the proxy war. Stoltenberg first proposed the plan in April, and he wants the details to be worked out before NATO leaders hold a summit in Washington this July. But the Politico report said more allies are reserved about the plan as it is unclear where the money will come from. One Eastern European official told Politico that the plan is confusing, and they're hoping that Stoltenberg provides more clarity. Other officials expect that the actual sum to wind up being much lower than the $100 billion. And I know that in other reports said that one of the ideas to fund this is to basically split it up based on the same rate that the countries contribute to NATO's budget, which would put most of the burden on the U.S. because the U.S. Pays for about 2/3 of NATO's budget. So we'll see what kind of plans they concoct for this summit in Washington in July. Last year was the big one in Vilnius where, Ukraine wanted some sort of promise toward, NATO membership and did not get it. And Zelensky was very upset. I don't really know what they're going to be able to come up with this year, but they're going to try to keep everything rolling along with this proxy war. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. appears to justify Israel's Rafah massacre. So the White House on Monday appeared to justify the Israeli strike on displaced Palestinians in Rafah that hit a tent camp and killed at least 45 people, including many women and children. In a statement on the massacre, a White House National Security Council spokesperson called it heartbreaking, but also said Israel had the right to go after Hamas and backed Israeli claims that the strike also killed 2 Hamas fighters. This spokesperson said, quote, "The devastating images following the IDF strike in Rafah last night that killed dozens of innocent Palestinians are heartbreaking. Israel has a right to go after Hamas, and we understand this strike killed 2 senior Hamas terrorists who are responsible for attacks against Israeli civilians." End quote. So it sounds a lot like they are justifying this slaughter that the whole world could see. I mean, again, it goes to show, you saw all sorts of condemnation from world leaders across the world, and the White House, Biden can't even make a statement. They just have some unnamed spokesperson make a statement to the press about this genocidal war that the U.S. is supporting and this new massacre, and this is the best that they can come up with. I mean, it's really... Anyway, according to Doctors Without Borders, the Israeli strike hit a camp in western Rafah that was designated a so-called safe zone by the Israeli military. And I know Gaza, Gaza's health ministry said that, the Palestinian Red Crescent said that. I saw Doctors Without Borders said it too, so I included that. So again, this is one of the places they just evacuated all these people from Rafah. This is one of the places they were told to go that was supposedly safe, and it gets bombed. And Gaza's health ministry said that the dead included at least 12 women, 8 children, and 3 elderly people. Another 3 bodies were burned beyond recognition, and if you saw the footage coming out from that strike of the fire, I mean, it's just horrific. Some of the most horrific things I've ever seen. Severely burned corpses being pulled out. There was one video that I tried to convince myself wasn't real because it's so horrible, but there's a video of a man holding up a body of a headless child. I saw that before I recorded yesterday's show, but I tried to just tell myself, it must not be real, it must be from something else. I don't know why, but it turns out that it was from the scene of this airstrike. And Axios reported that the U.S. is assessing whether or not the massacre crossed President Biden's red line. So again, explain that scene again. The burnt tents, the burnt bodies, the displaced Palestinians, the children being killed. I know one pregnant woman was killed. And they have to think, does this cross our red line? I mean, that just goes to show that there is no red line. Again, with this weak statement that they put out, they're not going to do anything. I mean, I would be surprised if they did anything. There's no consequences. After we had this warning from Biden that he would withhold heavy bombs from Israel if it launched a major attack on population centers in Rafah, they ended up supporting everything that Israel has done in Rafah since then. So after Israel initially claimed the Rafah massacre was a targeted attack, Netanyahu called it a tragic mistake and said that Israel would investigate the strike. But we've seen this when, the horror is just too, when the scene of the strike or whatever is just too horrific and the whole world gets outraged, you'll see them say, oh man, we didn't mean to do that. We'll investigate it. But there's never any follow-up. And the U.S. doesn't follow up. You see this in the press conferences with, what's his name, Matt Miller, the State Department spokesman. I know Matt Lee always asks him, the AP reporter, he'll ask him about certain incidents. About one thing I remember is there's been a few instances now where we've seen on video a Palestinian with a white flag, unarmed, getting shot. And Matt Lee would say, are you investigating this? And Matt Miller would say, oh, well, we'll get back to you on that. And then a couple days or a few weeks later, he'll ask him again. Matt Lee will ask him again, and he'll say, oh, we don't have any more information on that. And then by then, at a certain point, there's another massacre, there's another atrocity, so everybody forgets about it. That's just the pattern that we've seen. Remember the World Central Kitchen workers? Did the U.S. ever really follow up on that? It was clearly a targeted strike on aid workers. But anyway, in this article, I just said that it looks like, the U.S. appears to be happy to stay ignorant of Israeli war crimes, because we saw the State Department come out with that report that said Israel was likely breaking U.S. and international law with U.S. weapons, but we don't have the evidence to prove it, so we're just going to keep giving them weapons. All right, so the next one here, Egyptian soldier killed by Israeli forces near the Rafah crossing. So this article is from Middle East Eye. This happened, this came out early Monday morning here in the U.S. An Egyptian soldier was killed in an exchange of fire with Israeli forces at the Rafah crossing on Egypt's border with the Gaza Strip on Monday. Khan public broadcast said no Israeli soldiers were hurt in the incident, which left one Egyptian killed and others wounded. They said it was some sort of shooting incident, and Israel said that it was in dialogue with the Egyptian side. And the Egyptian military confirmed that one person was killed and that it is investigating the shooting. So it's not clear exactly how this started. But this is something, there's always been a risk of this. And of Israel, when this thing first started back in October, Israel was bombed the Rafah border crossing a few times. And now the risk of some sort of escalation with Egypt really increased when they captured the Rafah border crossing earlier this month. It looks like this isn't really going to turn into anything. But there's always a risk. And there's always a risk. You never know, even if, Egypt doesn't want to do anything. The soldiers, according to Middle East Eye, there's a report from an Egyptian newspaper that said Egyptian soldiers were affected by the Rafah massacre on Sunday. So, maybe there are some Egyptian soldiers who are not happy that their government is, basically a puppet of the U.S. and might want to do something about it. Who knows if something like that would actually happen. But I think, it's a possibility when there's this horrific violence going on right across the border. But for now, it doesn't seem like this is going to escalate into anything between Israel and Egypt. All right, so the next one here, Israel closing Rafah, a death sentence for thousands of ill and wounded. And this article is from Al Jazeera, and it's just about the medical situation it's for a lot of people in Rafah in southern Gaza, and some of them were trying to be evacuated for better medical attention, but the border crossing has been closed and now they can't get out. And the first person that they talk about is a 6-week-old. Sadil Hamdan was just about 6 weeks old when Israel launched its relentless war on Gaza. Now she lies silently on a pediatric hospital bed in Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital, weak, intubated, her belly swollen, and skin jaundiced. And that's a picture of her. 3 months ago, doctors managed to get her name on a list of patients who badly needed to leave Gaza for treatment overseas. But then, just days before she was to be evacuated, Israel invaded Rafah and closed the only crossing available for the sick to leave the besieged enclave, trapping Sadil and many others. And they talk about a few other people, including Abdul Majid al-Sabaki. He's 20 years old and lives on an oxygen respirator in a hospital. He's had cystic fibrosis since childhood. And, these are the people that have these other medical conditions, and then they can't get nutritious food and clean water. They're the first ones to die. They're the first ones to really be affected. So it's a few stories like this, and you see a picture of him before, October, and he's looking healthy, and now he's just looks like skin and bones. And it's just horrific situation as a result of this attack on Rafah. And those are just a few examples. All right, so the next one here, access to aid in Gaza was dire. Now it is worse. So this article is from the New York Times, and it is they have a good graph here so we could get an idea of the number of aid trucks that have been coming in lately. And you see right before Israel seized the Rafah crossing, the number of aid trucks that were entering Gaza were just under 300. We're in between 200 and 300. And aid groups say that they need 500. They say the bare minimum is 350. It hasn't gotten up to that level. And then if you look at after Israel seized the Rafah crossing, it dramatically dropped. There was a few days where no aid trucks were getting in. And then, between around 50 were getting in for a while. And it's gone up a bit since they opened the Kerem Shalom crossing and some crossings in the north. But still nothing close to before the Rafah attack. And I know yesterday I went over that they said 200 aid trucks entered through Kerem Shalom on Sunday, but apparently nobody's been able to distribute that. So still a lot of issues with the distribution of aid. All right, so the next one here, Knesset bill to label UNRWA as a terror group. So this is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. The Israeli legislature plans to hold a vote on a bill that would name the UN Aid Agency for Palestinians, UNRWA, as a terrorist organization. Since October 7th, Israel has killed hundreds of UNRWA staff in Gaza and alleged the group has ties to Hamas. So the Knesset is going to hold a preliminary vote on the law this Wednesday. There's going to be an initial vote, and there's going to be at least 3 readings that they would need before the bill passes. So UNRWA, this is they accused UNRWA staff. I believe they claimed 12 of their staff members participated in the attacks on October 7th. Because of those claims, the U.S. and a few other countries cut funding to UNRWA. And it turns out Israel never showed them any real evidence for those claims. But the funding's still cut. And, if they label them a terrorist organization, that means that that's pretext to attack them. They've been killing them this whole time. But I think if they pass something like this and it becomes law, we might see much more targeting of UNRWA, bombings and things like that. I believe over 200 UNRWA employees have been killed since October 7th. All right, so the next one here, nearly 9,000 Palestinians detained in the West Bank since October 7th. This article is from The Cradle. I mentioned, the other day, I need to really kind of cover the situation in the West Bank more. The Israeli army arrested about 20 Palestinians from May 25th to the 26th, bringing the total number of arrests in the occupied West Bank since October 7th to over 8,875. According to the Palestinian news agency Wafa, the arrests over the weekend took place across several areas in the West Bank, including Jenin, Bethlehem, Hebron, Nablus, and Ramallah, and Jerusalem as well. During the arrest campaign, Israeli settlers accompanied by police entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in occupied Jerusalem on the morning of May 26th. Local reports also indicate that the arrest raids caused widespread destruction of property. The report added that local enforcement was stationed at the gate of Al-Aqsa Mosque and prevented tens of worshippers from entering. And there's been more demolitions in the West Bank. And this has the updated, the death toll in the West Bank since October 7th is at 518. So that's quite a lot. And that's because Israel has stepped up raids in the West Bank, and we've seen some drone strikes in the West Bank. And also the settlers have been terrorizing Palestinians and increasing their attacks, taking advantage of the tensions and the focus being on Gaza. All right, so the next one here, Israeli strikes kill 2 in South Lebanon. So this one is from Jason Ditz. An Israeli drone strike struck the entrance to a hospital in southern Lebanon, killing an unidentified man on a motorcycle and wounding an estimated 10 others. 4 of the injured were said to be in critical condition. Israel did not comment on the attack, which is not unusual for strikes with uncertain outcomes. Hospital officials reported that most of the wounded were family members or friends of patients who tend to congregate by the entrance. The hospital was said to have received some damage in the attack. There was another strike later in the day, and Israel said that they killed a Hezbollah member in that one. And earlier in the day, Hezbollah fired an estimated 35 rockets at a base in northern Israel. No reports there was no injuries or casualties or anything on the Israeli side. So the escalations, the strikes continue. And this came just a day after Israel carried out multiple attacks, which also targeted people riding motorcycles across southern Lebanon. And at least eight people were killed in those strikes on Sunday. All right, so the last story here, Representative Michael McCaul leads a congressional delegation to Taiwan. So Michael McCaul, who's the chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, he is leading a bipartisan congressional delegation in Taiwan. And this trip comes right after China just wrapped up these major military drills that it conducted around Taiwan in response to the inauguration of President William Lai. So Lai is a member of the independence-leaning Democratic Progressive Party, and he took a more confrontational tone with the mainland in his inauguration speech. More confrontational than his predecessor, Tsai Ing-wen, who was also a member of the DPP. Beijing launched military exercises that it said were a punishment for separatist acts, referring to Lai's speech, and these exercises involved simulating a blockade on Taiwan. And these were the most extensive drills around the island since Nancy Pelosi went over there when she was the House Speaker in August 2022. And it's an important thing to understand, is that it goes to show how much these little trips that might not seem significant to us from U.S. officials really anger China, that the largest drills they ever launched around Taiwan were in response to the Speaker of the House going there. And China is opposed to all congressional visits to Taiwan and strongly criticized McCaul's delegation. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Mao Ning said, quote, "In disregard of China's strong opposition, relevant members of the U.S. Congress still decided to visit Taiwan, which violates the One China principle, the 3 China-U.S. joint communiques, and the U.S. government's own political commitment," end quote. So while he was there, and one thing, it'll be interesting to see if China starts launching, because again, like things have been escalating when it comes to the U.S. support for Taiwan, and I wonder if maybe they'll start just doing big drills or things beyond just flying planes across the Taiwan Strait in response to these congressional delegations. We will see. But McCaul made some pretty provocative comments during the start of his visit. He warned that Congress could declare war on China if it attacked Taiwan. Although Congress has not declared war since World War II. But listen to this quote. He said, quote, "If the island in an unprovoked manner was invaded, then it would be to the American people and the United States Congress and my committee that has the power to declare war, how to deal with that," end quote. So it would not be up to the American people, of course, but it's interesting. He says if Taiwan gets attacked in an unprovoked manner, so if an unprovoked attack happened, which of course they consider everything unprovoked these days, even though he's there provoking China. But McCaul added that for now, his job is to seek deterrence to avoid war, but the strategy the U.S. is pursuing is raising tensions in the region and making a conflict seem more likely. Increased U.S. military and diplomatic support for Taiwan in recent years has put the island under significantly more Chinese military pressure. The congressional delegation vowed that more U.S. weapons are on the way to Taiwan. What's interesting here is that $95 billion foreign military aid bill that President Biden signed into law. Remember, it was voted as 3 separate bills in the House. The one that received the most support wasn't Israel. It wasn't Ukraine. It was the one for Taiwan, $8 billion. And I believe about $4 billion of that is military aid for Taiwan, which the U.S. just began providing last year. And the rest goes to other spending in the region. That passed in a vote of 385 to 34. Again, it received the most support out of all the military aid. And McCaul in Taiwan, he noted the strong bipartisan support for arming Taiwan. He said, quote, "Even though there are debates about the other theaters of war, I can tell you there is no division or no dissension when it comes to Taiwan in Congress," end quote. And unfortunately, he is right. When it comes to China, Taiwan, it's just complete hysterics, and everybody seems to be on board with this new Cold War. And, whether people like it or not, sometimes people think I'm get upset when you talk about China and Taiwan and China putting all this military pressure on Taiwan. It doesn't really matter what we think about it here in the U.S. The fact is that Taiwan is always going to be so much more important to China than it is to the U.S., similar to Ukraine and Russia. And people have to be realistic, knowing what China is going to do in response to things. If the U.S. gives them more military aid, if the U.S. increases diplomatic support, China is going to put more pressure on Taiwan. That's just the reality of the situation here. And they seem to be prepared to just keep pushing as far as they can. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Christopher J. Coyne and Abigail R. Hall. In the fog of forever war, the U.S. no longer recognizes alternatives. One from Ted Snyder. It's time for diplomacy, not threats. One from Kit Clarenberg. How Britain sabotaged Ukraine peace. One from Dennis Kucinich. America's constitutional state of emergency. One from James W. Carden, global struggle for democracy is nothing of the sort. So that is everything for me for today. Please share this show. Tell your friends, subscribe if you're watching on YouTube, Odyssey, or Rumble. If you listen to the podcast, you could usually leave a rating or a review, depending on where you listen. Follow us on Instagram and on X and all that good stuff. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.